Eleanor Beaton here, and welcome to our exclusive series, Capital is a Verb. This 6-part podcast series explores women and capital, how we generate it, how we use it to build wealth, and ultimately how we deploy our capital to create businesses and an impact that is greater than we are. Here is why this series matters so much. First of all, women are taught how to earn money. Very few of us are taught how to deploy capital to generate wealth. This series explores the difference between revenue and capital and how understanding the difference is the key to building wealth, to creating enterprise value, and to ensuring your business gives you actual freedom and optionality. This series is critical to any woman entrepreneur because what we have observed is that many women entrepreneurs aren't under-investing in growth because we're timid or don't like to take risks. We're under-investing in growth because we don't have a clear capital framework to guide us in making those capital deployment decisions. When every dollar that leaves your business registers as a loss, growth becomes slower, it becomes heavier, and you tend to rely more on your own personal labor than on doing what wealthy people do, which is deploy capital to generate more capital. And finally, this series is so critical to every woman entrepreneur because capital is the bridge between your capability and your economic power. This series is going to give you a new way to think about profit, to think about revenue, to think about cash, and to think about investment, and how you combine those things to create businesses that generate long-term wealth and impact. When you do this, you are going to create a company that compounds rather than one that simply generates revenue. So without further ado, here is Capital is a Verb, a 6-part series on women, wealth, and capital, produced by the Woman-Owned Podcast. Hello, and welcome back to the Woman-Owned Podcast. I'm Eleanor Beaton, and today we are exploring the cost of capital conservatism. Sometimes playing it too safe can actually put you and your business at greater risk. That's what we're going to talk about today. Don't go anywhere. Recently, I was speaking with an operator in the Safi ecosystem, and this is an operator who has really created what we would call a powerful customer acquisition system. So she has a repeatable system. It took her 6 to 12 months to create this. She has a repeatable customer acquisition system that brings predictable, steady, highly qualified leads into her business that she can consistently convert to become paying customers. So this is just like a hallmark, right? It's systematic. She knows where her big fishing holes are. She doesn't have to do the guesswork. So this was a huge accomplishment. And it is the nature of life that solving one problem often creates a new one. And that's one of the fun things about business. And so she's got a new problem. And the new problem is she's got a lot of opportunity, and the opportunity, and not just the opportunity, but the actual business that she has converted is outstripping delivery's ability to meet the moment. So not only has she closed a lot of business, which is putting strain on her current delivery system, but she's got a lot of business knocking down her door. And because she has a system, she knows that she can keep doing this on repeat. She doesn't want to put her foot on the gas when it comes to sales and sort of her customer acquisition, but she has high standards for delivery and wants to do things in a state of high integrity. So you might be like, well, the obvious solution is to hire someone. And she's a smart operator. She understands this is the case. But one of the things that she talked about was the idea of taking this hard-earned profit, the idea of putting her capital at risk to make a hire that may or may not work out. This is the thing that's keeping her up at night. She doesn't want to spend the money. And I can relate to that. There have been lots of experiences, and when I'm not being intentional in business, there's lots of times that I just don't want to spend the money. Who wants to go out and spend the money? You know what I mean? Many of us would just love to see that money in our accounts just kind of growing. And this was fundamentally the thing that she was thinking about. But it's not just that. It's not just that she doesn't want to spend the money. The idea of deploying money to build her team just fundamentally feels risky. Now, the reality in my mind is I'm thinking about a very specific instance, but over the years, I have had, and our ecosystem, the Safi ecosystem has experienced this story or a version of this story over and over again. It's this idea that deploying capital, like spending money, registers like a loss, and ultimately it feels like it puts you at greater risk. That is ultimately capital conservatism. It's when you see any spending as a loss, not strategic spending as a gain, right? And so if you have noticed that when you spend money in the business, your knee-jerk reaction is that this feels like a loss, you know that you may have a case, you may be operating from a lens of capital conservatism. Now, interestingly, at Anchored, and so every year we do an event, a flagship event for the Safi ecosystem. It's called Anchored. One of the biggest breakthroughs and sort of takeaways from that event for so many of the operators was the work that we did around capital. And this idea that capital is a verb, it's something you deploy, and that there is a huge cost to not deploying capital. You pay whether you spend the money or don't spend the money. And we actually spent quite a bit of time looking at real life situations from these operator businesses where what it was costing them to not spend the money was many, many times what it would actually cost them to spend the money. And so this was a really interesting exercise that many of them had never had exposure to. And this kind of brings me to why capital conservatism can show up so frequently in women-led businesses. This is not because we as women aren't financially savvy. It is not because we are just, genetically more risk averse. That is an overly simplistic and actually inaccurate view of women's risk taking. There's a lot of research that shows women are, in fact, strategic risk takers. And I think our capital conservatism actually points to a couple of structural realities around women-led businesses that we have to take into account. So the first is that women-led businesses are typically undercapitalized compared to businesses led by men. And undercapitalized means that we don't have access to as much capital. And it's a really interesting thing. Like that lack of access to capital means our tendency is to deploy labor. So it's to use elbow grease, where our male counterparts who often will have greater access to capital, they would be more likely to deploy money, where we would be more likely to deploy our own labor. And that happens when the business itself is undercapitalized. One of the best pieces of advice that I got early in my business was to get access to money before you needed it. So that literally the first act that I took as an entrepreneur was to get a $2,000 business loan I didn't need. I used the loan to pay back the loan. It was not that strategic, but what it was, it sort of shaped a lens. It shaped a lens that was incredibly helpful through the rest of my entrepreneurial journey. So undercapitalization is one part, and that is a legitimate thing that women-led businesses experience. And so when you're undercapitalized, of course, you're going to protect the capital that you have harder, and you're going to have that lens of protecting the capital, which is so precious because it's a lot more scarce. You're going to protect it more. This is incredibly rational behavior. The second part is that we know that women are conditioned to focus on preventing downside versus our male counterparts who are generally conditioned to imagine and create the upside. So for example, there is a significant body of research in investor Q&As which has shown that investors will frequently ask women, hey, what could go wrong and how will you prevent that? And they will often ask men, what's the opportunity? What's the upside here? And so what that does is it starts to create, again, a lens of fundamental capital conservatism, so protecting against the downside. And then the third part here is I have observed in my years of being in the women's entrepreneurial ecosystem that we tend to receive disproportionately more advice around things like mindset, things like marketing, things like branding, all of which are important. I'm not saying they are not important, but that the incidence of us receiving like information and training and so on and stories about this is much higher than the incidence of us receiving more hardcore training around things like finance. So I think those three things come together that create a lens or explain where some of this capital conservatism can come from. It's actually quite a rational response to the gendered reality of being a woman founder. But what I want to do before I sort of solve this, and you're going to hear in the Woman-Owned podcast over the course of the next couple months, more of our thesis and more of our work around capital, but I want to do it sort of one block at a time. And today's block is to really take a look and understand the cost of being capital conservative. So in general, when a woman founder is capital conservative, she will do what the operator kind of wanted to do in the story I'm sharing, which is delay hiring. So that's often one of the most common things we'll see is delaying hiring. Why? Because hiring is expensive, especially if you have a high authority business. You're going to need expensive people, and so it can just feel incredibly expensive. And so often hiring gets delayed. And when hiring gets delayed, this often does one of two things. Number one, it stresses and strains delivery and customer experience. And when delivery and customer experience are strained, the first thing that gets impacted is customer retention. And customer retention is one of the primary profit drivers in a business. Do you see what I'm saying? So it costs you not only in terms of delivery being strained now and your team is under more strain and you are under more strain, but it also costs you triple later because it impacts your ability to retain customers, and customer retention is one of the primary drivers. It's one of the biggest levers you could have in terms of driving profitable growth. And then what this can, drive is just a founder feeling perilously close to being burnt out. And when a founder is worried about being burnt out, or when you feel, if I'm not careful, I could really, I could get into some trouble here, you are going to see yourself systematically put your foot on the brakes around sales and marketing. And again, this is a rational behavior. So I'm not saying you're wrong in doing that. It's a very rational response. The challenge is when we do that, we actually interrupt the natural level of momentum that we have created. Okay. And, some people say, oh, you're trying to be so perfect. You want everything to be perfect. No, it's not that. It's that we are rationally slowing down sales and marketing, the momentum that we were able to create. So we stop that momentum because we don't want to hire to fulfill typically the delivery, or that sales and marketing is creating its own momentum and you don't want to invest there. And so we slow momentum. And so you start having this stop and starting motion with respect to momentum, which is actually very difficult on a business. You're never able to get the business to a really good cruising altitude. Personally, I have experienced this, and this is why I really have sort of a hygiene practice, a CEO hygiene practice of really examining how I'm making decisions, And this is the same kind of hygiene practice that I hold the operators to in our ecosystem. It's critical because there's so much conditioning to be capital conservative that it actually puts the business at more risk. And I have experienced this. So for instance, I have experienced, not wanting to deploy around between like roughly $250,000. I didn't want to deploy that amount of money, and it cost me close to $1 million in profitable revenue. And the thing is, the cost of not deploying capital. So when you deploy capital, when you spend money, you see that money right in front of you. But the cost of not deploying capital, it's more like a quiet and devastating leak on the other side of the business. It's not as visible. And if we don't have a strong focus on finance, on strategic finance, you will almost never look at those quiet, silent, devastating leaks. It's like carbon monoxide poisoning. You can't see it, you can't smell it, but it'll get you, The purpose of today's episode is to establish this concept of capital conservatism, to show you the cost of being capital conservative, to show you why this is not you being a bad leader. It's actually a very rational response to some of the underlying structural constraints that women-led businesses experience. But nevertheless, we've got to deal with these things. And also to really set up the work that I will be sharing with you over the coming weeks and months as it relates to strategic capital. This is a really important frontier. So I've been working really hard behind the scenes on this. It's really tying together. I talk about capital and money a lot. We've had previous episodes, for instance, on this podcast called The Margin Stack. If you haven't listened to that, I suggest you listen to it. We'll link to it in the show notes. But what I'm working on right now is really pulling this together into a very clear thesis on capital deployment that provides you with a very strong framework that you can become a very financially strategic CEO in the business. All right. Thanks so much for being here. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this episode. Definitely connect with me on LinkedIn or Instagram. Let me know your questions about capital conservatism. Let me know if you're interested in hearing more about strategic finance. I mean, I'm going to be bringing it, but I'm nevertheless interested in what you have to say. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you here next week on the Woman Owned Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning into the episode. If you found value in what I shared, please go ahead and like this video, give it a thumbs up, and leave me a review or leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for being here. We'll see you next week.